incredibly painful. I distinctly remember desperately trying to make myself go to sleep at 7 p.m. to avoid the all-consuming hunger pains and sheer desperation to have food in my tummy. But gradually and slowly, I found myself cutting this down to 4 glasses of liquid vegetables a day, then 3, then 2, and then 1, until I decided that even that was too many calories and I settled on sucking boiled sweets to sustain me. I seemed to be unlocking a mental state that was even darker than my perpetual dieting, and I was inching closer and closer to an eating disorder. I ended up needing treatment for anorexia nervosa and bulimia nervosa. At the time, I was a fashion and beauty editor at a magazine. It was the job I'd always dreamt of, and I'd worked hard to get there. I had interned for years in 3 different cities, and I'd sent out more CVs than you could shake a stick at. But I finally had this job and I wasn't able to appreciate it. I was so desperately unhappy because of my eating disorder that I found very little pleasure in anything at the time. I also had an Instagram account with around 40,000 followers, all of whom were following me for my aspirational fashion and beauty pictures. My life looked so glamorous, but things really weren't what they seemed. I vividly remember a trip to Dubai in 2015 to interview Jessica Alba for a cover story. I was flown business class, I was put up in a 5-star hotel, and I was wined and dined at some seriously swanky restaurants. My friends, family, and followers just couldn't believe it. I was the luckiest girl in the world. Nobody had any idea that I spent the entire trip going back and forth to bathrooms, desperately battling bulimia. On the flight home, having purged, which means made myself sick for the 5th time and pulled a rib muscle in the process, I actually wondered if I was going to feel physically strong enough to lift my case off the baggage conveyor belt and get myself home from Heathrow. Struck by my increasingly frail appearance not long after, in 2015, my poor, deeply concerned mum gently but firmly demanded that I see a doctor. She referred me to a psychiatrist, and that marked the beginning, but certainly not the end, of my damaging relationship with food and my body finally taking a turn for the better. My recovery was long, hard, and painful, as recovery from anything that has damaged us tends to be. And my initial diagnosis morphed into binge eating disorder before I eventually, years later, found true food freedom and body acceptance. But getting treatment and setting my sights on recovery was, hands down, the best thing I've ever done for myself. I was lucky enough to be able to access professional help, and my therapist opened my eyes to diet culture, this arbitrary world where I'd lived my entire life, where nothing mattered as much as thinness, and thinness was unquestionably the key that unlocked happiness. An all-pervasive ideology that was built and thrives for one reason only: it makes a lot of people in the diet industry a lot of money. As I began to challenge diet culture, both inwardly through challenging my deeply held belief that I needed to be thin, and outwardly as well by acknowledging and debunking this overwhelming amount of messages that we are bombarded with that tell us all bodies need to look a certain way to be desirable or even acceptable, I discovered a wonderful alternative: the self-acceptance community. In 2016, plus-size model Iskra Lawrence shot to fame, making headlines for shaking up the fashion industry and its lack of diversity. I remember seeing her pictures and thinking how beautiful she looked and how incredible it was to see a woman who wasn't a size 0 being chosen for campaigns and magazine covers. I was tasked with interviewing her for a magazine piece, and I met her at a restaurant to chat. She was stunning, genuinely one of the most beautiful women I had ever laid eyes on, but it wasn't because of how much she weighed. It was down to her confidence, her self-assuredness, and her total lack of apology for being herself. I could hardly keep my eyes off her. The realization that her body was about so much more than how she or her body looked was strange for me, and it undoubtedly contributed to shattering a belief system that I'd relied on since I could remember. I left the interview feeling excited and inspired. I followed her on Instagram straight away, and in turn, I discovered a whole new online space.